Thank you. Well, as you just said, it's a complicated title and it's a complicated subject. There are interconnections between the various parts of it. I think I'll give a mainly historical background with a little bit of analysis to make the history somewhat intelligible. And I will start with the history of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. At the moment, there is one nuclear power in the Middle East, and that is Israel, which is either the fourth or the fifth biggest nuclear power in the world. Certainly behind the United States and Russia and China, but how to order it vis-à-vis the nuclear arsenal of Britain and France is a moot question. There is actually a very good historical sketch by no less an authority than the American Air Force. This is surprisingly dispassionate. This is you can see it projected there. I recommend reading it. It's a little bit old. It dates from 1999, and you can see that it's by USAF, United States Air Force. Researcher there, and mostly correct. I mean, it's not propaganda. It's not imperialist propaganda. It's what they want to know for their own purposes, but it's released probably because of freedom of information legislation. So, okay, the history of nuclear weapons should be started in 1956 with the Suez War. The Suez War is just a most important turning point in the history of the world, in the history of this country actually, because I think the post-war and sort of the end of British imperialism in its heyday is 1956, and this country changed in 56. The Middle East changed in 1956, let me take you to a conspiracy. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, just as even the paranoics do sometimes have enemies, conspiracies do take place. And the conspiracy in question was hatched in a villa in Sèvres near Paris. The hosts were the French, the British were invited, and Selwyn Lloyd represented Britain there, the foreign secretary, and but a little bit sort of diffident, reluctant, because he wasn't sure about this whole thing, and people who reported on it said that he was sort of, his face looked like he was smelling, something rotten, so stink. He was not very happy, but finally signed, and Israel was represented. This is, I mean, there is no other name for it other than a conspiracy or plot. A very sober historian, Avi Schleim, has an article about it in the 1997 issue of International Affairs. Very sober and respectable journal. But this is actually not on the disc, but you can easily find it if you Google. It's the 1997 issue of International Affairs, and the title of his article is "The Protocol of Sèvres, 1956: Anatomy of a War Plot." So I mean that's the only name he could find for it. It's interesting to look at the Suez conspiracy because it may actually be relevant to the war that is threatened now, as it may well be started in more or less the same scenario. I mean, the Suez War started. France basically initiated the whole thing. It wanted to overthrow Nasser, mainly because the regime of Egypt at that time, which was a secular nationalist, left-leaning secular nationalist, because it believed that this would enable it to win the colonial war in Algeria. They believed, probably was a very exaggerated feeling, that it was because of Nasser's help that they cannot win the colonial war in Algeria. That if they got rid of Nasser, then everything would go fine for them. So they were interested in overthrowing him, and of course win back the Suez Canal, which was French-British owned, and which Nasser had nationalized in the July of that year. So we are now in October 1956, 22nd to 24th, and they are hatching a plot. Israel will start, and then the French, supported also by Britain, would intervene in order to separate the combatants, as it were. So they would use an Israeli attack as the pretext for starting a war against Egypt, basically, calling it, you know, an attempt to separate the combatants. I think that if the present war is going to, the present plot is going to proceed with the attack on Iran, it's very likely that it will follow a rather similar scenario. That is to say, Israel will start, and then, of course, Iran will retaliate, as it must, cannot. And then it will be easier for the American administration to get the approval of Congress to intervene in order to save Israel, you know, their ally. It would be more difficult to get approval of Congress for attack on Iran out of the blue, whichever pretext they use. But to defend Israel, you know, if Israel is in danger, the second Holocaust and so on, so this is a possible scenario, and it will follow something like Suez. Anyway, the article that I mentioned by Adelstein contains in full the protocol, the agreement that they signed, which Britain insisted should be destroyed. All copies should be destroyed, but they weren't. The French kept the copy and the Israelis kept the copy, and so we know what they decided, and you can read it there. It's called the Sever Protocol of 1956. It doesn't contain the nuclear aspect, which came as an afterthought. Ben Gurion, then the Prime Minister of Israel, was long sort of planning for Israel to develop nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, mainly. Not all the Israeli leadership actually was unanimous in this. And it wasn't the more hawkish ones against the less hawkish ones. There was, for example, Yigal Allon, a general who was a former general who was a political leader and probably more hawkish than Ben Gurion, actually opposed Israel developing nuclear weapons on the following logic, because if Israel gets nuclear weapons, it will be difficult, especially given the conditions of the Cold War and so on, to stop other states in the Middle East also getting these weapons. Now, this will create a stalemate and will cancel Israel's existing superiority in conventional weapons. In conventional weapons, Israel had and still has clear superiority and could expand if it wanted to when the opportunity arises. If you get nuclear weapons into the Middle East, then it may actually create a stalemate and no further change. So it would stop any plans for Israeli expansion. Now, of course, the retort of the Ben Gurion and his assistants, among whom were the most important were Peres, who is now president of Israel, and Dayan, who actually was in charge of the Suez War from the Israeli side, was that they would try to develop nuclear weapons for Israel and try to stop anyone else in the region from getting them. It's a rather a tricky exercise. But so far they've managed. So At the very last day of this secret conference, 24th of October, and this we know from the memoirs of Peres, amongst other sources, Ben Gurion and Peres go to the French, Guy Mollet, the Prime Minister, and Maurice Bourges-Monory, the Defense Minister of France, and say, look, what you're asking us to do is very risky. It's a very politically very costly thing to start this war. We can find good pretext for it, but nevertheless, it's also risky militarily. What if it doesn't work? We want something for it. We want you to help us to develop nuclear energy. And the French were so keen for the thing to proceed that they actually agreed tentatively. And this is how it started. At that moment, there was no mention of nuclear weapons, although clearly that was the Israeli plan, to actually, proceed to a military use. But the French, this was a period, by the way, before the Israeli-American relationship became cemented. Israel got some goodwill and how shall I say, sponsorship from the United States in money terms and so on, but the relationship had not by that become so close. The closer relation was between Israel and French imperialism. And so the Israeli nuclear program began as a payment for services to imperialism. Excuse me for using cliches, but again, conspiracy, services to imperialism, but I don't have any other words that would express the actual contents of what happened. So this is, and eventually, but in 1960, de Gaulle came to power in France, and it became clear that Israel is actually looking for developing weapons, nuclear weapons, and de Gaulle wasn't very happy about it, and he tried to stop it, but he was actually undermined by one of his assistants, who was really extremist also on the Algerian question, and that is Jacques Soustel. Who was actually later in 1961 he was actually exiled from France because he disobeyed de Gaulle on Algeria. But anyway, he actually subverted de Gaulle's wish to stop this nuclear assistance and helped Israel to actually develop a proper installation for producing nuclear weapons. Which is the famous plant in Dimona. You can make a virtual three-dimensional tour of that installation, because on YouTube, I think I've got the URL somewhere on the disk, where you can actually go to YouTube, and there's a fantastic simulated three-dimensional tour of this huge complex in Dimona. Does it say? Yeah, right. So if you click on this, there's just the URL. If you are connected to the internet, you can have the tool now. But it's fascinating. It's a Hebrew commentary, but there's English subtitles. And you can visit the whole installation. This is based on the description, mainly on the description given by Vanunu, who is the famous. Well, anyway, if you email me, I can give you the URL of this very very interesting tour. Okay, it is now believed that by the time of the war of 1966 was the turning point in terms of Israeli-American relations. The present relationship, which is the real special relationship, not Britain and the United States, but Israel and the United States, became cemented in 1966. This is when Israel began to receive weapons from the United States on a very large scale. Is that it? That's a YouTube's website. If you want to copy it, It's actually very, very short, just a few minutes of tour. Anyway, it is thought that by the time of the war of 1967, which is another major turning point in the Middle East, Israel already had some nuclear weapons, and in fact, this was a sort of backup in case the Israeli attack goes wrong. The Prime Minister then, Levi Eshkol, insisted on having this, reassurance that if it goes wrong, then they could use nuclear weapons, which is just mind-boggling. But he also insisted that he would be the one to decide, and not Dayan, who was the actual one in command, because he didn't trust Dayan to be sufficiently responsible, maybe too trigger-happy. Okay, but by that time, as far as we know, the weapons hadn't been tested. Another milestone in this history is 1969. By 1969, we have Nixon as President of the United States, with Kissinger as a sort of, I think he was Secretary of State at the time. Because of the, again, freedom of information legislation in the United States, we have written exchange between Kissinger and Nixon. Kissinger became convinced that Israel has got nuclear weapons. And this is very worrying because the United States, well, I mean, this introduces complications. It wasn't the United States who actually initiated this. It was a hangover from the French connection. This may start an arms race in the Middle East, and it will complicate relations with the Soviet Union, the whole thing. So it was a headache for them. And finally, and you can see it in Kissinger's letter, which is again available, that they decided on the following stratagem, that they cannot reverse Israel having nuclear weapons. It's too late for that, but that it will be kept secret. And this is why Israel is the only nuclear power that doesn't actually brag about it, doesn't admit it even, right? So because they made an agreement with the Americans that it should be kept undercover and not officially admitted, and they sort of signed a rather strange formula that Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. What does it mean to introduce? Well, but so that was the agreement, and of course the agreement also included not testing nuclear weapons. So that was 1969. The next stage in the history is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed on the 1st of July 1968. Well, in fact, I'm going a little bit backward. By then, Israel already had nuclear weapons, and had it tested them, it could sign the treaty as a state which already has nuclear weapons. You see, the treaty distinguishes between those who have and those who haven't. Those who have are allowed to continue having them. Those who haven't are not allowed to develop them. But Israel, because of these negotiations with the Americans, didn't want to admit that it had it. So it didn't sign the treaty at all. And Israel is one of the 4 states that did not. There are only 4 states that did not sign it. Iran is one of the states that did sign it. Israel is one of the 4 states that did not sign it. The others being India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Okay? North Korea first of them changed its mind and signed and then withdrew. So the North Korean history is a little bit complicated, but anyway. So there you are. Now, eventually Israel did test make a nuclear test. And this happened on the 22nd of September 1979. Now, this is now connected with Iran, because that was the time of the hostage crisis in Tehran, you remember? And the Carter and his administration were all occupied with this, and Israel used the opportunity to do a nuclear test. The whole period during the 70s, Israel developed collaboration with South Africa under the apartheid regime. It got the so-called yellow cake, which is the best raw material for uranium from South Africa, which it got from Namibia. South Africa controlled Namibia, and Namibia is the main, one of the best sources for raw uranium. And they had a joint program, and they made a test on the 22nd of September in the Indian Ocean, between Africa and India, in a place which is not on the usual navigation routes, and which was supposed to be clouded then, which was supposed to be not detectable. There were already then some satellites, but they couldn't see through clouds. So they relied on weather forecast, and it probably did 3 tests consecutively within a short period. But something, you can't always rely on weather forecasts, and for a short time, the sky cleared and the satellite picked some flare. And this was, you can read it in the FAR report. This is a United States Air Force report. There's a little, somewhat muted account of this, but anyway, so the nuclear sort of experts in the United States were aghast. What is happening? There's a flash which is characteristic of some kind of nuclear explosion. What is going on? We were not told. And it was clear that it was a nuclear experiment, and as we know, it was a joint experiment between Israel and South Africa. But then they decided, because of all the embarrassment and so on, and because they had enough problems with Iran at the time, to deny, in other words, they just simply falsified the report, and if you read some of the papers immediately after the 22nd of September 79, you will see a report about unexplained probable nuclear explosion. A few days later, it was no, it was nothing of the kind. It was something else, a mistake. Mistake, and so on. And this was under the Carter administration. Well, whether he regrets it now, I'm not sure, but anyway. In 1986, the Sunday Times published a report provided by Vanunu, who was a technician in the Dimona plant, who gave a lot of details about the Israeli arsenal, which was sort of, how shall I say, cold noodles. Everybody knew, the facts were well known. Nevertheless, it was embarrassing for Israel, because this was a semi-official source for something that was supposed to be denied. And he was kidnapped by the Israeli security and kept in prison for nearly 20 years for revealing secrets that were not secret at all. I mean, nothing in what he said was terribly new, fresh news. But anyway, this is more or less the main lines of the history as far as that aspect is concerned. Now, I've mentioned the Iranian connection. Until 1979, until the Iranian Revolution, when Iran was under the Shah, Israel and Iran were the 2 pillars of American domination of this area. But they were not symmetric. The relationship was not the same. By the way, there was a third element, Turkey, but Turkey was at that time already in the process of turning its gaze from the Middle East towards Europe. So trying to become a European power, which is still in the process of, the process is not complete because it hasn't actually been allowed to join the European Union. But Turkey, which straddles the Middle East and Europe, was turning towards Europe and being less concerned with Middle East. But Iran and Israel. Now, structurally, the relation is very different. Because in the case of Iran, Iran is actually one of the countries whose resources are potential source of exploitation by imperialism. It is. You see, if you have a farm, then you have the farmer has pigs and cows and other animals that he exploits. Milks them and uses, kills them for meat and takes their wool and so on. But the farmer also has a watchdog, and the watchdog doesn't give any milk, the watchdog is used in order to control the rest. Now, the relationship between American imperialism and a country like Iran, even when a regime is amenable, is that of exploitation. This is not the case of the relationship with Israel, which is a sort of watchdog. And I mean, this metaphor has been used by other commentators, not particularly left-wing. It is a gendarme, if you like, of American imperialism in the area. This is the relationship. It is not, by the way, to use another doggy metaphor, unlike what some right-wing American and some left-wing American commentators say, like Israel is actually controlling the United States, the tail is wagging the dog, as we put it. It is not like that. Israel is the tail and America is the dog. It's not an Israeli conspiracy. By the way, the Iraq invasion is a very clear illustration of this, because Israel at the time, and this is provable, had no special interest or special wish to invade Iraq. And in fact, Sharon, when he was still fully alive, just before the invasion, was visiting the United States and tried to persuade Bush not to bother with Iraq. Iran is the main problem. And I will explain later why Israel is as keen, but even more keen than the United States to start something against Iran. The case of Iran is that even under the Shah, it was clear to the Americans that the services of Iran as a bastion of influence in the Middle East depends on the regime. And a revolution could, and in fact did, happen, and this may put the relationship at risk, as it has done. I mean, this is sort of put it at risk halfway. But it could have been a radical left-wing revolution, and then, that would really put an end to the United States' hopes to use Iran. In the case of Israel, this is not on the agenda. Israel is structurally dependent on the United States, and the relationship is mutual. It is a junior partner, in fact, which Iran never was. Iran could be, let us say, a dependency, or it could be a disobedient, as it is at the moment, a little bit of a, somewhat of a bad example to the rest, but it couldn't be a sort of watchdog in the American system in the Middle East. So, yeah, I mean, of course, these things changed in 1979-80 with the Iranian Revolution. Nevertheless, there is the curious episode, and I have to mention it, of the Iran-Contra deal. Well, that happened actually in 1985. It turned out that Israel was used as a channel for supplying rather serious American weapons to Iran, which was then engaged in the Iran-Iraq war. Now, the United States was mainly supporting Iraq in that war. Iraq was the sort of favored combatant, but not exclusively, because Iran was also given arms through Israel. And the plot was, again, there's no other name for it but plot or conspiracy, that the money for these arms, which would be channeled through Israel, would be used in order to finance the Contras in Nicaragua. And the whole thing came out. Actually, I mean, we know a little bit of details. The dealer on the Iranian side was a guy called Manucher Gorbanifar, who was a chum of the then prime minister. Iran had a prime minister at the time. As far as I know, it no longer has a prime minister. It has vice president. At the time, there was Mir Hussein Mousawi, who was the prime minister. And this guy, arms dealer, was a friend of his, and he was used on the Iranian side. Anyway, so it all came out through a Lebanese paper, probably as a result of leaks from some parties in Iran. The Israelis explained it. How could you supply arms to this regime that you detest? Well, they said, we are supplying it to the moderates with the hope that they may use it against the actual Khomeini supporters. But this is, again, it's a rather strange episode. It came out, and of course, the stink hasn't completely disappeared until this day. Okay, so now we are more or less, in the present situation, and I want to just say a few words as to what we should say, or what we can say about the threats presently against Iran. First of all, I think that the nuclear issue is, to a great extent, a pretext. It's not the real reason. The real reason is that Iran, despite not being a left-wing regime, is not serving as a bad example in the Middle East. It is not completely under the thumb of the United States, although it is not averse. There are signs, and I'm sure the Iranian comrades have done. I'm sorry to have missed the previous part of this workshop, but there are signs that at least some elements in the Iranian regime wouldn't be averse to making a deal with the Americans. Why not? There is no structural reason for them not to do it. Of course, this would be anathema to Israel, because that would actually demote the importance of Israel as a sole, ally of the United States in the Middle East, as the most important one, not sole. Of course, all these rotten Arab regimes in Saudi and Egypt and so on, are Jordan also in the American camp, but they're not really important junior partners. But Iran is something else. If Iran joins the American camp, so Israel, not by itself, but also in an alliance with some co-thinkers in the American regime itself, are the most, let us say, the most extremist in propagandizing for military action to prevent Iran developing even nuclear energy. I think we can debate. I mean, there is a question. Yeah, fine. We can debate whether Iran needs nuclear energy at all. I think that the so-called economic reason that Iran has so much oil, it doesn't need nuclear energy for peaceful use, is bogus. This does not hold, because if I had oil, given the present situation, I would like to keep it in the ground as long as possible. It only gains in value. It's a good investment not to extract it, depending on predictions about price and so on, but it may well be a better idea to develop alternative sources of energy and to keep the oil as much as possible as an asset for trade. So that is, and on the other hand, as the Israeli story illustrates, it is quite possible to start from a perfectly civilian application of nuclear material, which is, by the way, not forbidden by any international treaty. There is no reason, I mean, provided certain guarantees are adhered to, in other words, inspection and so on, there is no international prohibition on developing nuclear energy. Of course, some of us may be, for green reasons, against, or for various reasons, against using nuclear energy at all, even for peaceful purposes. But that is another story altogether. There is no political international treaty that forbids it. But it is also true that you can start with a development which is purely for civilian use and then proceed. It is not too difficult or easier for them to proceed to military application. So whether Iran has such plans or not, I mean, nobody can prove it one way or the other. I have seen no proof that, despite what you read in American and American-inspired propaganda, there is no proof that Iran has plans for developing nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, the Iranian regime denies that they have such plans, but I don't believe everything that they say. So why should I believe this? So I mean, it's quite possible, and there is always this is dangerous. It is dangerous for anyone to. Proliferation of nuclear weapons is dangerous, and I think we should all be in favor of nuclear non-proliferation for disarmament in the whole world. But why not start with the Middle East? But you cannot, and I think there is no moral possibility of resisting, of opposing Iranian development of nuclear weapons while ignoring the case of Israel. You can demand, you can make propaganda, you can struggle for nuclear disarmament in the whole area, and that should include Israel as well. I don't say otherwise. The danger is still there, and this is a constant provocation and an invitation for others to develop nuclear weapons simply as a protection against the Israeli threat. So I think that the right political stance would be nuclear disarmament of the whole of the Middle East as a part of the or as a stage for nuclear disarmament of the world as a whole. That's all I plan to say, and let's have a discussion.
Okay, we'll open it up to the floor then. I'm going to be taking a few questions and comments at a time, and then allowing Moshe to come back just to keep it moving. Steve?
You spoke quite a lot about why America would want to attack Iran, but something that never necessarily left out, but you didn't put enough emphasis from my perspective on, was why Israel would want to attack Iran. And I don't think it's adequate just to say that because it's a lapdog of US imperialism. That is why it would want to attack Iran. As far as I am concerned, obviously the devastation caused in Iraq and Afghanistan shifted the power of the balance of power within the Middle East, bolstering Iran's expansionist aims for the region. It's got a lot more influence now than it ever has done. And this is a threat to Israel because Israel's got its own expansionist ambitions for the region, and it wants to play on them, but it can't because obviously that roadblock to that is Iran. I think the greatest thing we can do as the left is to look past our noses and look past this facade that the BBC is telling us and actually look at the relationship that Iran and Israel have. It's only in the last 8 or so years since the first invasion perhaps of Iraq that relationships have actually soured. We've had great relations. You mentioned yourself the Iran-Contra affair. $2.5 billion worth of weapons was traded between the two. This isn't even touch upon the amount of trade that happened with oranges. I mean, artichokes was the greatest. Well, that's going on a different tangent. But trade between the two countries has always been great until the Iraq and Afghanistan war. He also, in the late 80s, initiated this project called Project Flower, which was trying to build a new missile on the lines of the US Harpoon missile. I mean, this is joint military adventures, even in spite of US opposition between Israel and Iran. So I think maybe as the left we need to reanalyze why Israel and Iran have maintained such clandestine relations, and I think that is precisely because of the interests of capital. Make sure that Israel and Iran need these relationships to happen. And I don't think it's adequate enough to say that because the US is an enemy of Iran, Israel must therefore be too. I think Israel is the opportunist and it is the main antagonist.
Can comrades make sure they've got their phone switched off, please? Torab?
A few points. First of all, thank you very much for a very informative talk. This question of the deal between Israel and Iran during the Iran-Iraq war goes back to the hostage crisis. Before the election, the father of the current Bush actually went and had open face-to-face discussion with Rafsanjani. And Rafsanjani managed to persuade him that we won't release the hostages until after the election, so that Reagan can use it as a good
credit, yes, to take the credit.
And then Bush agreed that they would give some arms to Iran, Rapier missiles. Basically, that's what Israel supplied. So this goes back to that deal between our senior Bush and Mr. Rafsanjani. On the question of the current attitude of Iran and the USA, basically, Yasaman remembers 6 years ago, before the invasion of Iraq, we could see the signs of this. Because after Afghanistan and the collaboration between Iran and the US invasion of Afghanistan, a year before the Iraqi invasion, there were monthly meetings between Iranian representatives and American representatives inside Iraqi Kurdistan to actually negotiate, in case of invasion, what Iran can do. In that period, it seems the Iranian regime itself decided this is the best time to get rid of the reformists. Because if you remember, at the time, we had the reformists on the rise, trying to negotiate with the West and saying we would reform the Islamic State. Basically, the hardliners, the Pasdaran army, basically the military wing of the Iranian regime, decided this is a good opportunity to get rid of the others and tell USA, if you want to make a deal, I am the guys who has the power to make the deal. We are the ones who can deliver. And this is the line Iran has followed ever since, and now it has become completely open. Now openly the Iranian regime says, if you make a deal with me, if you recognize me, then we have no problem. We can sit and negotiate over everything else. Now the correspondence between the Iranian regime and US administration has become open. That this actually, letters being exchanged between leaders of the Iranian regime. And basically what the Iranian regime wants is, don't talk about any change of regime, then we are open for any deals. We are ready to reach any agreement. But my main question is this. It's very interesting what you started with, the scenario that the war can develop. Israel attacking first, and then USA and European imperialists justifying the intervention because of peacekeeping mission rather than invasion. It's funny you say this because the Iranian monarchies, who are very much in favor, section of the Iran, not the actual official Iranian monarchies are denying that they are for American invasion. But actually the hardcore Iranian monarchies are, this is their only hope, that if USA invades Iran, they may, get back their throne, basically. Now, within them, lately, in the last 3 or 4 months, there's a lot of debate that before Bush goes away, Israel is going to attack. Apparently, they have their ears to the ground a bit better than us, and this is the story they're telling each other.
This is been really in the Israeli press. I mean,
yes.
Mofaz, who by the way is Iranian.
But what is not emerging is how is Israel going to do this? Because you cannot fly over Iraq.
No.
The latest story, and this is my question, how realistic is this, or is this science fiction? That Israel actually has submarines in the Mediterranean. Would they be able to get to the Gulf, or would Americans, I don't know if you've read this fiction book, apparently a submarine would go inside one of the American, aircraft carriers, and then the aircraft carrier would take it to the Gulf. Then they release it into the Gulf, this Israeli submarine, to launch, missile attack. I mean, what is the discussion in the Israeli press in terms of how Israel is going to attack Iran?
Can I come back on this too? Because as for the first intervention, I think I was misunderstood completely It is not as though the reason why Israel has this attitude to Iran is because of American interests, and nothing can be further from the truth. Actually, I mean, it is not. Israel is not a puppet of American imperialism. It is a junior partner, but they have divergent interests in some cases. Not always, not always coincide. At least not, not with the dominant section of the American elite. Israel has its own plans, its own interests, which are not necessarily agreed to by whoever is in power in the United States at the moment. Iran is a special thorn in the Israeli side because the real ambition that was articulated especially by Sharon and his now successor, the same party who is still prime minister before he gets maybe into jail because of his corruption. Was for real Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. True, hegemony as a subcontractor, but of course that Israel cannot be a hegemon in the area without American approval and without actually serving the American interests. But it wants to be the main partner. It doesn't see kindly competition from, let us say, a potential Iranian regime that would be also friendly to the United States.
Another subcontractor. Another subcontractor.
Another subcontractor, maybe. And Iran is a big country. It's a big, potentially, with a large population, large army, and so on. So, I think I mentioned it, that just before the Iraq invasion, Israel was trying to persuade the United States not to bother with Iraq. Now, the United States had its own interests, which have to do with oil and so on, strategic interests which have very little to do with Israel, to invade Iraq. But from the Israeli point of view, and this is not, as you suggested, after the mess in Iraq, and because it strengthened the Iranian regime. The Israeli military political elite were saying since 1992 that Iraq is not the problem is Syria and Iran. So it's not something new. I mean, I've got interviews, open interviews. The head of military intelligence interviewed in April 1992 in the Israeli paper, saying, Iraq, in reply to a question. Torab's intervention, everything is true, and the question is how they are going to do it. I think the idea of the invasion can be almost certainly ruled out. You really have to be mad, in order to contemplate, especially after the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq. Land invasion is out of the question. Massive bombardments by missiles, air and from the sea. Israel certainly has submarines that could do it, also missiles and aircraft that could reach there. And this recent bombardment in Syria, in parts, I think one of the more reasonable interpretations was as a sort of both demonstration, and also an exercise towards this kind of thing. It is not that far, and refueling. Why cannot they fly over Iraq? I don't know. I mean, who will prevent them flying over Iraq? And they can refuel if necessary. So that is not the problem. The technical problem, there is a technical problem. The problem is, from the Israeli point of view, and this is why they are reluctant, or some of them are reluctant to actually play this role, is because of the Iranian retaliation. If they can be reasonably sure that they have enough, let us say, umbrella technological ways of dealing with the most damaging possibility of Iranian retaliation, then they would go ahead tomorrow. So, and we don't know what they have got and how reliable. You see, they've got some means. I mean, you hear in the Israeli press. I haven't seen any speculation about how to attack. This is this you can only use your imagination and your the rational analysis. That it's not going to be by land. That it will come by missiles and so on, but. The doubts that are expressed is about the possibility of defense, sufficient defense, so that the Iranian retaliation, which is known, I mean, Iran is known to have quite, good missiles, conventional, but Israel is a small country and with a very